The next thing that we'll explore with populations is how they grow. And I don't quite just mean, well, are they reproducing fast or slow, even though that does have a little bit to do with this, but really looking at, are they growing rapidly? Are they growing slowly? Are they growing at all? Or maybe their populations are declining. And so that's what we're going to explore in this lab. So very simply, the first thing we need to know is how quickly is a population growing. And so we need to figure out our growth rate. Our growth rate is our birth rate, which is represented by B, minus our death rate, represented by D. And so very, very simply, the rate of growth is your births minus your deaths. Now, because this is a rate, this number should vary somewhere between -1 to 1. We're essentially working with ratios or percentages. So it's not the number of births and the number of deaths. It's looking at the percentage of births in our population, or the ratio of births in our population. So very simply, we can look at that growth rate as R equals B minus D. So for example, if a population has 5 births per individual and 10 deaths per individual, per 100 individuals, what is the growth rate in the population? So what I'm going to first do is I'm going to turn these births and these deaths into a ratio. So population has 5 per 100, so this is B equals 5 out of 100, which equals 0.05. And it has 10 deaths per 100, so D equals 10 divided by 100, which equals 0.1. And the question is, what is the growth rate? So we need to find R. So in this case, R equals 0.05 minus 0.1. R equals -0.5. So when R is negative, that means that the population is declining. And if you look back at our original problem, this should make sense. We had 5 births but 10 deaths, so we lost 5 individuals. Now you notice it says per 100 individuals. We need that number to figure out the rate, which is why, again, R is a percentage. So if R is negative, it means our population is declining. If it's positive, it means our population is growing. And then sometimes R might equal 0. So here's 3 other problems. I'll do the first one with you. So if we have 5 births and 5 deaths per 100 individuals, I could do all the math, but 5 minus 5 equals 0. So that's 0 out of 100. So in this case, R equals 0. When R equals 0, this just means the population isn't growing. This does not mean there are no births, and that's really, really important distinction. As you saw, we did have births. It's just we had the same number of births as we did deaths. The second question, very similar to the example, we had 6 births per 25 and 7 deaths. So right here, you can at least tell me, okay, R is going to be negative. I had more deaths than I had births. And it's -1/25. Which equals -0.04. Now this last one I'm going to have you do as an answer to your pre-lab quiz, but this one's looking at 10 births per 50 and 35 deaths per 75. Now in the real world, the births and deaths would be given on the same metric by the same number of people, but this is really just a test, do you know what you're doing? So in this case, we have 2 different denominators. I don't recommend keeping this in fraction form. Go ahead and divide 10 divided by 50 and get a decimal. Go ahead and divide 35 by 75 and get a decimal. It makes it a lot easier to figure out that ratio. So again, if you want, you can go ahead and work out this problem while we're on this slide, but I will ask you for that answer in the pre-lab quiz. So we know the growth rate, and when I said how do populations grow, I was really looking at 2 different types of growth. The first one we'll talk about is exponential growth, and the other one we'll talk about in a little bit is logistic growth. So one way that a population can grow is exponentially. And if you've taken a math class recently, you might be familiar with exponential growth. This is essentially unregulated growth. There is nothing that is stopping that population from continuing to grow. And more or less, they're doubling their population every generation. On the right-hand side, you may want to sketch this in your notes. This is an example of what an exponential growth curve might look like. You start out with a low number of individuals, and it starts growing a lot. It grows exponentially. And if we wanted to, we can continue this on and on and on, and hypothetically or mathematically, it could go on forever. We'll talk about why that doesn't really happen in nature. This is also nicknamed a J curve, literally because of the way it looks. So we have a low population in the beginning, and then over time we get this shooting up. Now this does happen in nature, and what I'd like you to do is actually take a look at this YouTube video, and it actually shows you an example of an organism that exhibited exponential growth, and you can see kind of the devastation it had in its environment. So go ahead and actually watch it now. So pause here. There is a link popping up right above me. Go ahead, pause this, click that link, watch that video, and then come back here. But even in that video, that population's not going to grow forever. Earth literally could not handle an infinite number of any species. There are definitely factors that will limit that population at some point. And those factors can be divided into two different categories. And we'll talk about each one individually in just a moment. So the first one is density dependent. These factors depend on how dense the population is. If it is more dense, like this population of penguins on the left-hand side, those factors play a bigger role. But if it's less dense, those factors might not play any role on regulating that population size. On the other hand, we have density-independent factors. These are factors that affect a population, whether the population is humongous or whether the population is pretty small. So in this case, it would affect both of these penguin populations the same way. So let's take a little bit closer look into those. So density-dependent factors. Essentially, you're getting more and more competition with one another. So they might be competing, the individuals in that population, they might be competing for food, for air, for sunlight, for nutrients, for water. The more organisms you have, the less everyone gets. And so that might slow down your population size because there's literally not enough to go around. Similar to this, a type of resource is also territory. When we look at territorial organisms, if they don't have a big enough territory, they don't reproduce. And if they don't reproduce, then their populations are going to slow down in growth and maybe even stop growing. Also, when you have much larger populations, the likelihood of disease and parasitism to make a huge impact on that population increases. If you guys have ever taken your dog or maybe even cat to get kenneled if you're going out of town, you probably know about this. The best place for a dog to get kennel cough is at a kennel. Kennel cough can happen to anyone, but with a whole bunch of dogs in one small area, if one dog has it, it's very easy to spread to individuals. But if you just kept your dog at home and it's not around any other dogs, yes, it might get kennel cough, but it's not around other dogs to spread it. So the more dense you are, the more likely things can spread. And then finally, depending on the organism, you might see an increase in predation. So in this graph, we see an example of the snowshoe hare and the lynx. The snowshoe hare is represented in red, and the lynx is represented in blue. And what you can see here is actually a boom and bust cycle, where both of these organisms exhibit exponential growth, but then they crash. And typically, it's the snowshoe hare that increases first. So let's take a look at this first complete curve. Here's the snowshoe hare increasing and just going off the charts. The lynx eats these snowshoe hares, and because there's so much food around, their population's increasing in size as well. They have a whole bunch more food, which means they can reproduce more, make more offspring, and those offspring have food, so on and so forth. But eventually, that lynx population gets too high, and they're eating too many of these hares. And so as they're eating all of these hares, that hare population starts crashing, Because it's starting to crash, there's not enough food to go around with the lynx, and so they start crashing. And you can see this is actually data taken from Canada and from their fur trapping industry. You can see that this happens about every 10 years, this cycle. And so we have this huge period of exponential growth, and it crashes due to predation. On the other hand, you might have density-independent factors. Density-independent factors are going to affect a population no matter how big it is. And this is typically things that are out of their control. It's mostly natural disasters. This could be a forest fire, tornado, drought, flooding, maybe even human caused, such as water or air pollution. For example, this field of crops, if there is a drought, they're going to die. Whether there's 100 crops in there or 10 crops in there, it's affecting the populations the same exact way. Same with a forest fire. Whether there's 5 deer or 1,000 deer, neither of those populations made that forest fire happen. It just happened, and it affected those populations the same way. So both of these factors can control that population size. So when it comes to that exponential growth, thinking back to what we were talking about before, exponential growth will lead to a crash. We saw that with the snowshoe hare and the lynx. So J-curves or exponential growth will always lead to a crash, mainly because of density-dependent factors. Eventually, that population may run out of food, might not have as many places to live or to breed. There might be more disease, there might be more parasites, there might be more predation. So this is going to happen pretty much no matter what. There's no way in the world for a population to increase exponentially forever. If that was the case, Earth would be covered in species, like legitimately covered. Like we're talking feet and feet, if not miles tall, of organisms all piling on one another, if there was nothing limiting their population size. This is another example. This is looking at reindeer on an island off of Canada. They were actually introduced to the island in 1910 as a food source for a military base that was situated on that island. And you can see that these reindeer exploded in population. There was no natural predators on the island other than the humans that were shooting them for meat. And eventually they crashed. This was probably the point where they had eaten all the vegetation on the island. And they crashed so much that their population completely sank, and it actually went extinct on the island. That sounds kind of bad, but at the same time, they weren't on that island to begin with, so I guess nature fixed it, so to speak. But we see this all the time. Yes, we see exponential growth, but eventually it will lead to a crash. So that's one type of growth. The other type of growth is logistic growth. And logistic growth is something that we see more commonly happen in nature. And what happens with logistic growth is that population reaches some sort of maximum value. And we refer to that maximum value as the carrying capacity. As you can see in this graph, we call these S curves because it literally looks like an S, which you can see here. It actually starts out, so this part of the graph here to the left-hand side actually looks like logistic growth, looks like exponential growth. We have a period of low population size that starts growing really, really rapidly, but then there's a point. There's a point where the population growth slows down. The number of individuals added every generation becomes less and less. And that's because the population is nearing that carrying capacity. And this is what we see for a lot of organisms because it's more in balance and more in equilibrium with nature and with the ecosystem. And so that's kind of why we see it all the time. Not to say that it's what we see exclusively. Just one last thing, I want to touch on that carrying capacity. What that carrying capacity is just the number of organisms an ecosystem can support indefinitely, forever, infinitely. Use whatever word you want to use. So thinking about those reindeer, maybe that island could have supported 500 reindeer. Those 500 reindeer are eating grass, but that grass is growing back in enough time for those reindeer to eat it again. And so 500 reindeer could live on that island forever because the resources on that island were replenishing faster than those reindeer were using it. That's what we refer to as a carrying capacity. And we also kind of refer to this as a sustainable ecosystem. That island was sustainable if it had 500 reindeer. It ended up having thousands, and those thousands of reindeer were eating the grass faster than that grass could replace itself. We can talk about this in human terms as well. Humans are probably not very sustainable. We're using a lot of our resources faster than they're replenishing themselves. Another note I want to make is that we're looking at mathematical models, which are nice and smooth and beautiful graphs, but that's not always what happens in nature. And this graph in blue is what the mathematical model of logistic growth looks like, whereas in red is the actuality of what's happening in nature. So what you might see is this population is growing exponentially, it starts leveling off. They do have a crash, but it's a small crash. They're not going extinct, they're not losing a majority of their population, but they're eating more of that grass and the grass is becoming available. And so they go down. But now that they're below the carrying capacity, they could support some more individuals and they go up again. And it's kind of a fluctuation around that carrying capacity. So just keep in mind that it's not like, oh, the reindeer reached 500 deer. Now it'll be 500 forever. Sometimes it'll go to 530. Sometimes it might dip down to 400. But it's staying around that carrying capacity because there's enough resources for it. So that's the end of this introduction. Go ahead and review through your notes and take that pre-lab quiz. And in lab, we're going to explore these mathematical models a little more and look at some data from real life situations here on Earth.